If you have your lesson books with you this morning, we're going to be in Matthew, the 4th chapter. I'm sorry, Matthew, the 6th chapter. I'll get it right. But anyway, let me say this. We're getting in a series of now Jesus' his ministry. And in Matthew, the 6th chapter, can be broken down into 5 different basic sections. We're going to be studying today 2 of those sections on giving and in prayer. Those are going to be the 2 things that we hit on today. The title of our lesson today is God Honoring Piety. Or God honoring our religious works, our reverence to Him. But anyway, God honors the work that we do and our obedience to Him. As Christians in our lives, as studying this lesson, we are challenged with a great balancing act in our lives as Christians. I think we've all been on a seesaw or toddling board. But as Christians, through our life, we are like being on it. We're up and down. We've got to be careful in our actions and the thing that we do. And I said, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, these 3 chapters encompasses Jesus' Beatitudes and His teaching, not in parables as much in these 3 chapters as direct quotations that He gives. But if you look at Matthew 5:16, I'm going to show you the balancing act that we as Christians a lot of times in our lives have to do. Matthew 5:16 says this: in the same way, that's just coming right after the Beatitudes, let your light shine before others. Let your good works, in other words, let them shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, then we go to the very next chapter, the very first verse, and look what it says here. It says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Now, let's stop right there. We come to say, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others. If we just stopped right there, then we would see a contradiction, wouldn't we? But look what he says, the writer says after that, Matthew does. In other words, be careful about how you practice your righteousness if you're doing it just to be seen by people, is what he's saying. if you do this, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. What Jesus is teaching here in his lessons is this. You remember when Jesus, or not Jesus, but you remember when Samuel went to Jesse to anoint the new king? He made a statement to Jesse. And he said, God doesn't see just the outward appearance of man, but he looks at him from the inward appearance. But this is what this balancing act that we have to play in our lives. God is all the time wanting us to do good deeds, doesn't he? We are to take care of the needy in our lives. And you know, all the way through history, that's been the work of the church a lot of times, is to take care of the needy and the orphans. The literary context of today's lesson is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It encompasses, as I said before, chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew's Gospel. But you know, the middle section of Jesus' sermon explains challenging ideas in our lives. Jesus stressed that true righteousness means righteousness not just on the outside appearance, but it comes from the inside of a person. This leads up to Jesus' condemnation of hypocrites and hypocrisy. We're going to be studying today about the word hypocrite. But keep in mind in today's text, the word hypocrite is not used in today's text as we see a hypocrite being used today in the church. The Greek word and that we get from the word hypocrite was used in the Greek language as a play. A person who put a mask on. They were on stage. They were playing a part. What Jesus is saying here, in this text here, that those people who put on false faces, in other words, that do acts of good for false reasons, those are hypocrites, because they're playing a part that is not truly their self. Today's text introduces the first of the series of Jesus' teaching regarding motives of the heart. His preferred method of teaching was all throughout the scriptures has been used in parables. And you see that in Matthew 13:34. And it says this, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. To bring it down to a child level, I guess, a parable is heavenly meaning with earthly sayings. But today's text is a picture of Jesus' teaching by means of plain spoken directives. We see him as he starts his ministry. Let me ask you this before we get into our lesson. You don't have to give an answer, but just try to visualize in your past. Have you been blessed by receiving a gift, a needed gift, from an anonymous donor? Have you ever received a gift that you didn't know where it come from? Have you ever had the opportunity to help someone in life anonymously that they didn't know that you were helping them? Or have you received a needed instead of a wanted gift from somebody? You know, a lot of times we're all the time getting gifts, but a lot of times we drop little hints. And people usually give us things that we want. But have we ever received something that really needed and we didn't even think about it? Or finally, have you ever been embarrassed by receiving a gift? I think a lot of times, I know myself speaking, I can answer some of these to the positive. But this is the whole thing that Jesus is talking about in the beginning of his teachings, is our giving, how we give, and what we give it for. The writer gives this little story explanation in today's lesson. You know, in verse 1 it says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness," or let's break that down in everyday language, our alms, our giving, our charity, our good works, or our good deeds. These all encompass what righteousness is. He said, be careful how we practice this in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do this, in other words, if I do something, not because I really want to do it from my heart, but I do it because I want people to know that Dean Thornberry did this. He says, I've already received my reward. And I receive no other reward from the Father in heaven. The writer tells about an incident that happened. You know, a lot of times, a lot of churches have what they call mortgage burnings. Have you ever heard of that? Where they take from the house the church has paid off, or the building or land. They have a special service and they burn the mortgage. Well, they had about $100,000 they owed. And they went out to raise that $100,000 in order to get out of debt. As the writer says here in the lesson, that everything went great. Matter of fact, it was surprising to him just how fast the money came in. He knew he had people in the congregation, several people that could have just paid the whole $100,000 off if it had wanted to. But the purpose was for the church, each and every one, to give their share. Well, the story come down to this. Came down to only $20,000 left to be owed. There's two men in the congregation. They had decided, each one of them had decided to give $10,000 each. But they held up on giving it because they're waiting for each one to give theirs first so that they could say that they were the one that put him over the top. Well, I think this verse fits that very well. Be careful how we try to show our good deeds. Yes, they had, I guess, in their hearts, it was a good thing they were doing. No doubt about that. But they had the wrong way of going about it. If you look in verse in Deuteronomy 15:11, you know, Moses said this: there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and who are needy in your land. If you go back and you study God's way of training his people, he told them, even the farmers, you remember this? He told them, he said, when you are gleaning, leave so much around the boundaries of your property so that the needy and the poor could do what? Come in and get food for their families. It's always been God's desire for his people to take care of each other. And that's the desire, it should be the desire of the church today, that we take care of each other. Matthew 9:4 says this: knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, why do you entertain evil thoughts in your heart? No matter what we do in life, we think a lot of times things are kept secret. They might be from other people, but there's one person we can never keep a secret from, and that's God. 1 Samuel 16:7 says this: but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance. You know, that's when he went to Jesse to anoint David. He said, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearances of people, but the Lord looks upon the heart of man. You know, we can't, as individuals, we cannot read people's minds. We just can't do it. But God can. We look at what people do in the church and we give praise for it, but the judgment's going to come from between them and God. Chapter chapter 6, 2 through 4. This is a little cartoon that it takes, I think, says pretty good much about what Matthew is writing in 6 chapter verses 2 through 4. Jeffrey Smith is a cartoonist who takes scripture and he visualizes those in cartoons. And he says this little cartoon is showing the purpose of doing things in secret, or doing good deeds or gifts, trying to stay in the middle of that seesaw, in other words. It shows this little poodle here going up to this other dog. It says, are your donations for the needy in that bag? And the dog says, quiet. Just act natural. And I'll slide the bag over to you when no one's looking. That's pretty good, isn't it? He's wanting to keep what he's doing to himself. But then he goes on, he says, you keep a lookout that way. For in Matthew 6, 2, 4 says that our giving should be done in secret. So just pretend you don't know me. And she looks at him and says, if only that were true. A lot of times, we try to hide things, but yet we don't want to hide things. So we see in Jesus' teachings, as he said in verse 2, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues or on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. In other words, they've only received what glory they've received, they've already received it. They're not going to receive any more. Can you imagine what it was like as I read the scriptures and I read this and I try to visualize these religious people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essex, all of them with their outward appearances, their tassels with all the bells at the bottom and all the plaques on their wrists and their foreheads, all announcing publicly who they are. Jesus tells us, Matthew does here too, that do not be that way in our life. And then we see in verse 3 and 4, we see this. Matthew says, but when you give to the needy, do not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. I believe it. That the writer here, Matthew, is saying this. And Jesus makes this remark, don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing. I think a lot of times in our families, that he said, be careful of your own immediate family. Don't let them know what you're doing. Because a lot of times you get resentment, especially if you have families who are not all living for Christ. So I think we as Christians, a lot of times we're better off. When we give, it's not to even let our own spouses know that we're giving it. I believe I say that honestly. Then I think a lot of times that we are better off a lot of times just to not let even the church know. Anybody in it, what we're doing. But as long as we do things from the heart, it doesn't matter if I give something and Chris sees me give it, or you see me give it. If it comes from a true heart, it doesn't matter. But I think a lot of times it's hard. It's hard a lot of times. And I know we're all human. We all like to be, every now and then, have a pat on the back. But I think a lot of times we take that pat on the back a little bit too far. But I think the writer says that when we give, especially to the needy, we should do it without anyone knowing about it. There's an interesting story about a guy that named Mueller. He did so much work for orphanage children and the needy. After his death, it became that he never asked nobody for donations. He never went publicly. All he would do was pray to God that God would make a way that he could take care of the people. You know, that to me is faith. That's what our faith is trusting enough in God that we can actually go to him and he will provide. I can remember in my life as a young man, a young boy really, I can remember when the ground, we have what we call CCYC in Buck County County. It's a place up on top of a mountain. It's up there, right up on the top of the highest mountain in that area, Baldwin Mountain. And it used to be an old strip job. Well, the minister at that time had a vision of having a place that people could come and pray and fellowship. Well, the land was donated by a man. And if I recall, if I can recall right, at the particular time that the land was donated, the man wasn't even a Christian at the time. But he gave that land to the church on one condition: that no one would know where it came from. Well, it went for years and years and years. That place has become one of the greatest retreats for Christian men as well as women to go to Children go there all year round practically. But he didn't give land to have a name or to be known. He gave it because he knew it would be used for the work of the Lord. Jesus' teachings on what to do and what not to do has a lot to do with our giving today. He tells us not to show off our generosity. In other words, don't stand up and say, look, here's what I did. This is what I gave to the church. Don't get me wrong. I've heard it all my life. I've heard people, they will brag a lot of times. Some have. But like Jesus says, their reward, they've already received their reward. But Jesus tells us, don't show off our generosity. Don't try to give in a noticeable way in order to impress others. In other words, if I was fortunate enough, God blessed me enough to be wealthy, and I seen the church needing something, I should voluntarily just give it without standing up and saying, oh, hey, I'm going to do this for the church. Don't do things just because you want to impress others. But do it because you want to impress one person. We want to impress who? God, don't we? So when we do good deeds or when we do things, we do it from the heart to impress God Almighty. The things that we should do, though, when we're giving, is be careful about how you give. And secondly, give as much as possible and give it in secret. That's why a lot of times my father and mom was different. My father usually never gave money in a collection or checks in collection place. He never took anything back from the Secretary of the Treasury for tax purposes. He always just gave cash. My mom was different. She would always give her gifts and check form or something like that. But I think here, the writer here is telling us this. When we give as much as possible to the point that what? It does not take away from your other responsibilities of your families. How many times have you heard where people have given everything they have to the church or to a minister? If you can afford it, that's fine. But I think here the writer is telling us when we do give, is do it in a way that, as we said earlier, the right hand don't know what the left hand is doing. Do it in secret. And you know, there's an old saying, it's not a secret tell somebody not to tell it. It's not a secret unless you keep it to yourself only. Then in verse 5 of Matthew, it says this. And when you pray, now we're going to go from giving to the second part of Jesus' discourse in verse 6, and that is prayer. You know, Jesus himself even made the statement to his apostles when he was getting ready to go to the cross. He said, you will always, well, we back up. It's when the girl came to the house of Simon and she was anointed him. And afterwards he talked to his disciples and he said, you will always have the poor with you, but I will not be here all the time. Jesus even knew that there would always be needy people. There would be people that we couldn't take care of always. But I think the purpose of the church first is to do what? Is to take care of their own needy first. And I believe that verse, charity begins at home, fits that very well. If you have needy people in your congregation, and this is one of my pet peeves, I think a lot of times we have congregations that if they would just look at their own congregations, they would find more needs, or if not as much needs in them as they would by sending money somewhere else. So I think a lot of times we as a church, we get caught up in the point of giving to the needy. And as the old saying is, don't see the forest for the trees. We don't see the needs of our own congregation. And I think when he says give to the needy, I think we have to look at our own congregations first. Then he says in prayer in verse 5, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. In other words, this Greek word hypocrite, now remember, that word hypocrite is someone is making a play, is playing, okay? He's got a face on. And for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. And he says, truly I tell you, you have received, they have received their reward in full. And verse 6 says this, but when you pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathens do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. You know, I think we all can say this. I've heard prayers in my lifetime that were less than 2 minutes long. That said more and meant more than some prayers that I've heard that last 15 minutes maybe. I think this is what this is saying about. Come to the point. God already knows what we're going to say. He already knows what we need. But if you go back and you study at the reasons when Jesus was giving this discourse here in Matthew, it was traditionally that there were men on the street corner everywhere you went, frankly. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, they were constantly praying in public. And there's nothing wrong with praying in public, let me say this, if the heart's at the right place. But their heart wasn't at the right place. You remember in Matthew, I can't remember the exact verse right now. But remember the publican and the Pharisee? The publican, they both went out to pray. And the publican said, God, I'm thankful I'm not like this man. And then the other one, the tax collector looks up, puts his hand to God and said, God, forgive me, I am a sinner. And he said both left, and which one was more fully blessed? The tax collector. Go back and look how short that prayer was. He knew he was a sinner. He knew he needed help. And his prayer alone, less than 15 words, God said he left being sanctified. Then in verse 7, we have this. But when you pray, do not use vain repetitions, as the heathens do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. I was reading this and I got a little chuckle. And I say this, not being sarcastic or judgmental to anyone, but it just come to me about, I heard a prayer one time. The prayer was very lengthy, but the same thing was saying over and over and over. I think this is what Jesus is saying here. Say what's on your mind and get rid of it. Don't keep going over and over and over. If I ask God to forgive me for my sins in my secret praying place, I think it's my point is to just say, God, just please forgive me for my sins. No. Confess to God what sins you want him to forgive you of. If I've been very judgmental against a brother, God forgive me for being judgmental. If I've been racist against him, God forgive me for having these racist thoughts. If I falsely accuse somebody, God forgive me because I falsely accused Chris. These are the prayers that God wants to hear. He already knows what we need to pray for. He doesn't need to hear our prayer. He doesn't need to hear them. But the reason we pray is why? Not for God's benefit. It's for our benefit. It's for us to come into a better relationship with our Father. That's what prayer is about. And you know there's an old saying, if you don't use it, you forget it. You lose it. Prayer is the same way. Communication is the same way. If you don't speak to the Father, then you're going to get to the point that you cannot speak to the Father. He doesn't need us to come to Him. We need to go to Him. And in the last verse, and I'll close with this. Our Father knows what you need before you ever ask Him. Stop and think. Just stop and think how awesome our God is. How many times as parents that your kids come to you and ask you for something you know good and well what's it going to ask you before they ever come to you? But you're not going to give that child something unless they come and ask you. How many times has a child been persistent? Our Father's the same way. He knows what we need. But if we're persistent in asking, a lot of times, He might just give it to us. If I was to ask in my prayer, and this is something I pray for every day, Father, give me wisdom and knowledge. And I just stopped right there. How much do you think God's going to listen to that? I don't think He listens to me that. But in my prayers, I say this: Father, give me wisdom and knowledge that I can serve you better and understand your word better and follow you in the right paths. I'm explaining now to God in my prayer why I'm asking for something. God already knew I want wisdom. He knows I need wisdom. He knows I have to have knowledge and understanding. But He's wanting to hear from me. He wants to know, do I really want it? I'm a child of God. Just like my children, when they used to come to me and ask me for things, I say, no. Daddy, can I have it? No. Daddy, can I have it? No. Daddy, can I have it? Okay, I'll let you have it. I'm not saying God's that way, but I mean, He can be changed. If you don't believe it, read the event of Moses' life. How many times Moses changed God's way of thought. So, to sum it up, when we serve the needy, we are to do the best we can, but do it in a way that we don't want glory for ourselves, but we look and give the glory to God. Thank you.